Stain Boy, Junk Girl, Melonhead, The Pincushion Queen, Anchor Baby, The Girl with Many Eyes, Robot Boy, and Sue. These are just some of the strange, tragic comic characters that inhabit The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy and Other Stories by Tim Burton. This slim 1997 collection of short verse stories, limericks, and illustrations is characteristic of Burton's fondness for stories of misfits, social outcasts, and monstrous quirks of human conception grappling with the unfortunate karmic circumstances that life has thrust upon them. From the outset, the style of illustration and the design of the characters will be immediately recognizable to fans of Burton's films, particularly his work in stop-motion animation. We can see variations of these characters in films like Vincent from 1982, the Henry Selick directed The Nightmare Before Christmas from 1993, Corpse Bride from 2005, and the underrated Frankenweenie from 2012. In my opinion, one of the director's most personal and essential films. Taking many of the monstrous, misunderstood archetypes of characters familiar from the kinds of old horror films and science fiction B-movies the author loved as a child, such as robots, mummies, voodoo dolls, and alien oddities, then contrasting these icons of the fantastique with a more recognizable, domestic, often suburban setting, Burton is able to ground these darkly funny, absurdist vignettes in something that is both human and oddly relatable. In the best stories, he finds a tone that is macabre, absurd, imaginative, and sometimes cruel, flitting between silliness and something occasionally more thought-provoking, as the unspoken subtext of the stories point a finger of blame at either uncaring or unsympathetic parents, or at the world itself, which fails to find space for such eccentric characters. While much of the writing here is ironic, glib, pitiless in its dramatization of these poor unfortunate characters, born into a world that neither wants nor understands them, the presentation of these characters isn't without sympathy. While we might be invited to gawk at the larger-than-life oddities that make up this collection, to find humour in their unfortunate circumstances, the tone is never entirely derisive or judgmental. This is evident in the way Burton records the struggles of his characters, as if their efforts to simply exist on their own terms are defiance enough against the cruelties of a world that marked them as monsters. Again, there are similarities here to Burton's own films. The author's affinity for the strange and unusual, for characters driven to the margins of society, is a consistent theme in many of the director's most successful films. For example, in The Plight of the Unloved Robot Boy, we might think of the equally tragic Edward Scissorhands from Burton's 1990 film of the same name. Another mechanical man, half-formed and ill-equipped, to navigate the complexities of human life. In Jimmy the Hideous Penguin Boy, the obvious point of comparison is the Penguin from the director's 1992 blockbuster sequel, Batman Returns, one of Burton's most openly impassioned portrayals of the monster as victim of the cruelties and selfishness of the modern world. At just 3 lines of text, Jimmy the Hideous Penguin Boy is barely even a concept, let alone a complete story in verse, but it does have one of my favourite illustrations of the entire collection, the blood red of the imprisoning bars creating a bold contrast against the black and white of the illustration. In other stories, the titular mummy boy would crop up as a supporting character in the aforementioned The Nightmare Before Christmas, while Staring Girl from the story of the same name looks remarkably similar to the character Weird Girl from Frankenweenie. Some of the verses in the collection are several pages long, while others are a few short lines. Poetry fans will likely find little merit in the work, dismissing Burton's writing style as primitive and repetitive, defaulting as it does to the same basic rhyming scheme across each of the collected stories. However, literary merit doesn't seem to have been an aspiration for the author. Here, the text serves the illustration, rather than the illustration serving the text. As a filmmaker, Burton is effectively a visual artist, and the appeal of a collection like The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy and Other Stories will be in the author's distinctive style of illustration, and in his warped, macabre, slightly whimsical view of characters, unable to conform to the conventions of society. It's a collection of sketches, creative doodles that give us a further insight into the author's mind, his quirks, his creative obsessions. The centerpiece of the book is the title story, The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy. The longest of the poems, its verses spanning several pages, the story begins with the same glib, ironic, darkly comic style as many of the shorter verse stories collated herein. It tells the story of a married couple, horrified to find that their newborn baby is part human, part mollusk. The illustration style here, with the drawings literally boxed in, like a little storyboard, might suggest Burton's unfulfilled aspirations of turning the story into a film. The style is also immediately reminiscent of the art of Edward Gorey, one of Burton's biggest influences. However, as the story of Oyster Boy unfolds, it becomes a much darker, more sinister tale, touching on themes of child neglect and abuse, before culminating in a shocking act of cannibalistic infanticide. The tonal shift from ironic amusement to something genuinely quite devastating and upsetting speaks to the often underrated subversiveness of Burton as termite artist. This is true also of the story Anchor Baby, in which Burton, either purposely or not, uses the courtship of a sea nymph and a rock musician to offer a veiled commentary on how couples often see having a child as an opportunity to paper over the difficulties and differences in their relationship, and how men, having used women for pleasure, will abandon her with the burden of a small child, which they, as deadbeat fathers, take no responsibility for. In this context, the final image of the sea nymph trapped at the bottom of the ocean, factually and figuratively weighed down by the baby as literal anchor, is a pertinent if somewhat harsh visual metaphor. While one doesn't necessarily look for deeper themes, politics, or sociological subtext in Burton's work, the surface of kitsch appropriation and the postmodernist contrast between conflicting influences tend to be the angles that define the whole. There are a few moments across the collection here that hint at darker, more troubling themes and ideas, and that give the stories an undercurrent of something occasionally more profound. Of course, I say this as someone who is arguing the serious socio-political subtext of Burton's films on my old blog as far back as 2013, writing about how Dark Shadows from 2012 could be read as a thinly veiled industrial satire on the plight of the family-run business against the influence of a more powerful conglomerate. Or that his 2010 film adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, rather than being a folly of CGI excess and eye-gouging 3D, could actually be interpreted as a psychodrama, exploring the horrors of Third World genocide, villainy as true outcome of the hero's journey, and the darkly transformative nature of war. So I suppose you can take this endorsement with a pinch of salt. Nonetheless, I think you could certainly have a Freudian field day questioning why so many of these verses are about children born with abnormalities, and what this might have said about Burton's own potential fears of one day becoming a parent at the time that the book in question was written. The stories also capture the author's fascination with characters who are feared, abandoned, and hated for the differences that so often mark them out as brilliant and unique, which again is a theme that recurs in many of Burton's best-known films. While the circumstances of these characters remain no less unfortunate, Burton nonetheless finds wonder in the quiet struggles of those unable to conform to society's expectations. As such, these strange creations, while silly and often childlike in their amusing abstractions, become like aspirational figures to the eternal outsider, of which Burton, despite his ongoing Hollywood success, seems to identify